mini lecture, we're going to show a quick derivation of the quadratic formula. Um, we start off with a quadratic equation in standard form, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, as shown here. What we're going to do is apply the completing the square method to this equation in standard form, and then eventually that will lead us to the quadratic formula to show where it comes from. So the first step in the completing the square method is to move the constant over. So I'll rewrite this as ax squared plus bx equals negative c. Also, I want to get rid of the coefficient that's in front of the x squared, so I'm just going to go ahead and divide everything by a. Once I do that, I'll have x squared plus b over a x equals negative c over a. Alright, so that step was complete. The next step in completing the square method is to actually use our formula b over 2 squared. So our b value is b over a, and this is over 2 squared. In looking at this, b over a divided by 2 over 1 is what we're really saying. Really means b over a, well, I'll write it out, divided by 2 over 1. Right, this whole thing squared really means b over a times 1 over 2, right? Because when you divide fractions, you flip the second fraction and change it into multiplication. So now it becomes b times 1 is b, a times 2 is 2a, and then we're still going to square this, so we get b squared over 4a squared. Alright, so I have that b squared over 4a squared, and in completing the square method, we take that and we add that to both sides of the equation, right? So I'm going to add it to the x squared plus b over a x, and add it right here, plus b squared over 4a squared equals negative c over a plus the b squared over 4a squared. Alright, before moving on to the next step, the thing I want to do is just clean this up a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and add those two fractions. I'll show my work on the side over here. Negative c over a plus b squared over 4a squared. So in looking at this, these two fractions have different denominators, and we were always taught that when that's the case, we need to find the LCD. So the LCD here is 4a squared. Now we divide the old denominator into the LCD. So a goes into 4a squared 4a times. 4a times that c is 4ac. Well, this old denominator is just like the LCD, so nothing will change for this one. And now we can go ahead and write the numerator over the same denominator as the LCD, and we just go ahead and subtract b squared minus 4ac. Well, let's just go ahead and write it like that, b squared minus 4ac. Alright, so that's what we get. We get b squared minus 4ac all over 4a squared. Alright, and this is equal to this left hand side. Well, the left hand side, and in the next step of completing the square, says that this should be a perfect square trinomial, which it is, and we should be able to rewrite this as a binomial squared. So this will be x plus, and I'm thinking what goes here to complete this perfect square trinomial. If I can't think of it, I can always look to right before where I squared it, which is b over 2a. Right before you square it is the same thing that will always go in there within this completing the square method. So the next step in completing the square method, and it's important to have the steps to completing the square next to you, is to use the square root property. So in the square root property, we take the square root of x plus b over 2a squared equals plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 4a squared, and you can see it coming together nicely. When we square a square root, they're inverses, so they cancel, so we're left with x plus b over 2a is equal to plus or minus, and I'll separate these a bit. B squared minus 4ac, we can just go ahead and use one of these properties, right, for radicals, the quotient property. So we can separate these, and it becomes the square root of b squared minus 4ac over the square root of 4a squared. What I'm going to do is just go ahead and take the square root of that denominator on that right hand side. So I'll keep this b squared minus 4ac in the radical, and the square root of 4 is 2, the square root of a to the second is a. Alright, next thing, we always want to solve. So the last step in completing the square method is to solve for x. We're always solving for the x. So we're just going to subtract this b over 2a from both sides, and that'll give us x is equal to negative b over 2a plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, and this is all over 2a. Right? Looking at this, these two fractions on this right hand side have the same denominator, so why not just write them all over the same denominator? So we have negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac, and there it is. We've derived the quadratic formula, and this was achieved through using completing the square method and completing the square on the standard form of a quadratic equation, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Alright, feel free to share this with friends, family who may be interested or in need of it. Please hit the like button, be sure to subscribe. Feel free to email me for any other videos that are needed. Take care.